The Cyprus dispute or Cyprus issue is an ongoing issue centered on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus and dating back to at least the end of the 19th century. Ever since, it has been present under different forms. In its current phase, it is primarily an issue of military invasion and continuing Turkish occupation of the northern third of the island, a situation described and deplored in multiple UN reports and resolutions. Although the Republic of Cyprus is the sole legitimate state, sovereign over all the island, the north is de facto under the administration of the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is under Turkish Cypriots and Turkish army control. Initially, with the annexation of the island by the British Empire from the Ottoman Empire, the Cyprus dispute was identified as the conflict between the people of Cyprus and the British Crown regarding the Cypriots' demand for self-determination. The dispute, however, was finally shifted, under the British administration, from a colonial dispute to an ethnic dispute between the Turkish and the Greek islanders. The international complications of the dispute stretch far beyond the boundaries of the island of Cyprus itself and involve the guarantor powers, the United Nations and the European Union, along with the United States. With the occasion of 1974 Cypriot coup d'état copyright tat, Turkey invaded in Cyprus that same year, and occupied the northern part of the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus. Later, upon the occupied territories, the Turkish Cypriot community unilaterally declared independence, forming the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, a sovereign entity that lacks international recognition with the exception of Turkey, with which TRNC enjoys full diplomatic relations. As a result of the two communities and the guarantor countries committing themselves to finding a peaceful solution to the dispute, the United Nations maintain a buffer zone to avoid any further intercommunal tensions and hostilities. This zone separates the free, southern areas of the Republic of Cyprus, from the northern areas. Recent years have seen warming of relations between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, with officially renewed reunification talks beginning in early 2014. Historical background. Prior to 1960, the island of Cyprus was first inhabited in 9000 BC with the arrival of farming societies who built round houses with floors of terrazzo. Cities were first built during the Bronze Age and the inhabitants had their own Ito-Cypriot language until around the 4th century BC. The island was part of the Hittite Empire as part of the Ugarid Kingdom during the Late Bronze Age until the arrival of two waves of Greek settlement. Cyprus experienced an uninterrupted Greek presence on the island dating from the arrival of Mycenaeans around 1100 BC, when the burials began to take the form of long dromos. The Greek population of Cyprus survived through multiple conquerors, including Egyptian and Persian rule. In the 4th century BC, Cyprus was conquered by Alexander the Great and then ruled by the Ptolemaic Egypt until 58 BC, when it was incorporated into the Roman Empire. After an interval of Islam Caliphate, the island returned to Roman rule until the 12th century. After an occupation by the Knights Templar and the rule of Isaac Komnenos, the island in 1192 came under the rule of the Lusignan family, who established the Kingdom of Cyprus. In February 1489 it was seized by the Republic of Venice. Between September 1570 and August 1571 it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire, starting 3 centuries of Turkish rule over Cyprus. Starting in the early 19th century, ethnic Greeks of the island sought to bring about an end to almost 300 years of Ottoman rule and unite Cyprus with Greece. The United Kingdom took administrative control of the island in 1878, to prevent Ottoman positions from falling under Russian control following the Cyprus Convention, which led to the call for union to grow louder. Under the terms of the agreement reached between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, the island remained an Ottoman territory. The Christian Greek-speaking majority of the island welcomed the arrival of the British as a chance to voice their demands for union with Greece. When the Ottoman Empire entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers, Britain renounced the agreement and all Turkish claims over Cyprus and declared the island a British colony. In 1915, Britain offered Cyprus to Constantine I of Greece on condition that Greece join the war on the side of the British, which he declined. 1918 to 1955 . Under British rule in the early 20th century, Cyprus escaped the conflicts and atrocities that went on elsewhere between Greeks and Turks. Notably the Greek genocide, during the Greco-Turkish War, and the 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Turkish Cypriots consistently opposed the idea of union with Greece. In 1925 Britain declared Cyprus to be a crown colony. In the years that followed, the determination for enosis continued. In 1931 this led to open revolution. A riot resulted in the death of 6 civilians, injuries to others and the burning of the British government house in Nicosia. In the months that followed, about 2,000 people were convicted of crimes in connection with the struggle for union with Greece. Britain reacted by imposing harsh restrictions. Military reinforcements were dispatched to the island and the constitution suspended. A special epicourical police force was formed consisting of only Turkish Cypriots, press restrictions instituted and political parties banned. 2 bishops and 8 other prominent citizens directly implicated in the conflict were exiled. Municipal elections were suspended, and until 1943 all municipal officials were appointed by the government. The governor was to be assisted by an executive council, and 2 years later an advisory council was established. Both councils consisted only of appointees and were restricted to advising on domestic matters only. In addition, the flying of Greek or Turkish flags or the public display of portraits of Greek or Turkish heroes was forbidden. The struggle for enosis was put on hold during World War II. In 1946, the British government announced plans to invite Cypriots to form a consultative assembly to discuss a new constitution. The British also allowed the return of the 1931 exiles. Instead of reacting positively, as expected by the British, the Greek Cypriot military hierarchy reacted angrily because there had been no mention of enosis. The Cypriot Orthodox Church had expressed its disapproval, and Greek Cypriots declined the British invitation, stating that enosis was their sole political aim. The efforts by Greeks to bring about enosis now intensified, helped by active support of the Church of Cyprus, which was the main political voice of the Greek Cypriots at the time. However, it was not the only organization claiming to speak for the Greek Cypriots. The Church's main opposition came from the Cypriot Communist Party, which also wholeheartedly supported the Greek national goal of enosis. However, the British military forces and colonial administration in Cyprus did not see the pro-Soviet Communist Party as a viable partner. By 1954 a number of Turkish mainland institutions were active in the Cyprus issue such as the National Federation of Students, the Committee for the Defense of Turkish Rights in Cyprus, the Welfare Organization of Refugees from Thrace and the Cyprus-Turkish Association. Above all, the Turkish trade unions were to prepare the right climate for the main Turkish goal, the division of the island into Greek and Turkish parts, thus keeping the British military presence and installations on the island intact. By this time a special Turkish Cypriot paramilitary organization Turkish Resistance Organization was also established which was to act as a counterbalance to the Greek Cypriot enosis fighting organization of the OKA. In 1950, Michael Maskos, Bishop Makarios of Kishan, was elevated to Archbishop Makarios III of Cyprus. In his inaugural speech, he vowed not to rest until union with Mother Greece had been achieved. In Athens, enosis was a common topic of conversation, and a Cypriot native, Colonel George Grivas, was becoming known for his strong views on the subject. In anticipation of an armed struggle to achieve enosis, Grivas visited Cyprus in July 1951. He discussed his ideas with Makarios but was disappointed by the Archbishop's contrasting opinion as he proposed a political struggle rather than an armed revolution against the British. From the beginning, and throughout their relationship, Grivas resented having to share leadership with the Archbishop. Makarios, concerned about Grivas's extremism from their very first meeting, preferred to continue diplomatic efforts, particularly efforts to get the United Nations involved. The feelings of uneasiness that arose between them never dissipated. In the end, the two became enemies. In the meantime, in August, Papagos government 1954, Greece's UN representative formally requested that self-determination for the people of Cyprus be included on the agenda of the General Assembly's next session. Turkey rejected the idea of the union of Cyprus and Greece. Turkish Cypriot community opposed Greek Cypriot enosis movement, as under British rule the Turkish Cypriot minority status and identity were protected. Turkish Cypriot identification with Turkey had grown stronger in response to overt Greek nationalism of Greek Cypriots, and after 1954 the Turkish government had become increasingly involved. In the late summer and early autumn of 1954, the Cyprus problem intensified. On Cyprus the colonial government threatened publishers of seditious literature with up to 2 years' imprisonment. In December the UN General Assembly announced the decision not to consider the problem further for the time being, because it does not appear appropriate to adopt a resolution on the question of Cyprus. Reaction to the setback at the UN was immediate and violent, resulting in the worst rioting in Cyprus since 1931. EOKA campaign and creation of TMT, 1955 €59. In January 1955, Grivas founded the National Organization of Cypriot Fighters. On April 1, 1955, EOKA opened an armed campaign against British rule in a well-coordinated series of attacks on police, military, and other government installations in Nicosia, Famagusta, Larnaca, and Limassol. This resulted in the deaths of 387 British servicemen and personnel and some Greek Cypriots suspected of collaboration. In 2009, a memorial for the British soldiers killed by Greek Cypriot EOKA during 1955–1959 Cyprus emergency was erected in Kyrenia, northern Cyprus. As a result of this a number of Greek Cypriots began to leave the police. This however did not affect the colonial police forces. They had already created the solely Turkish Cypriot Reserve Force to fight EOKA paramilitaries. At the same time, it led to tensions between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. In 1957 the Turkish Resistance Organization, which had already been formed to protect the Turkish Cypriots from EOKA, took action. In response to the growing demand for enosis, a number of Turkish Cypriots became convinced that the only way to protect their interests and identity of the Turkish Cypriot population in the event of enosis would be to divide the island a policy known as Taksam Taqsam in Arabic, a euro into a Greek sector in the south and a Turkish sector in the north only. By now the island was on the verge of civil war. Several attempts to present a compromise settlement had failed. Therefore, beginning in December 1958, representatives of Greece and Turkey, the so-called motherlands, opened discussions of the Cyprus issue. Participants for the first time discussed the concept of an independent Cyprus, that is, neither enosis nor Taksam. Subsequent talks, always headed by the British, yielded a so-called compromise agreement supporting independence, laying the foundations of the Republic of Cyprus. The scene then naturally shifted to London, where the Greek and Turkish representatives were joined by representatives of the Greek Cypriots, the Turkish Cypriots, and the British. The Zurich-London agreements that became the basis for the Cyprus Constitution of 1960 were supplemented with 3 treaties: the Treaty of Establishment, the Treaty of Guarantee, and the Treaty of Alliance. The general tone of the agreements was one of keeping the British sovereign bases and military and monitoring facilities intact. Some Greek Cypriots, especially members of organizations such as EOKA, expressed disappointment because enosis had not been attained. In a similar way, some Turkish Cypriots, especially members of organizations such as TMT, expressed their disappointment as they had to postpone their target for Taksam. However, most Cypriots that were not influenced by the 3 so-called guarantor powers, welcomed the agreements and set aside their demand for enosis and Taksam. According to the Treaty of Establishment, Britain retained sovereignty over 256 square kilometers, which became the Takalia sovereign base area, to the northeast of Larnaca, and the Akroteros sovereign base area to the southwest of Limassol. Cyprus achieved independence on August 16, 1960. Constitutional breakdown and intercommunal talks, 1960 €74. According to constitutional arrangements, Cyprus was to become an independent, non-aligned republic with a Greek Cypriot president and a Turkish Cypriot vice president. General executive authority was vested in a council of ministers with a ratio of 7 Greeks to 3 Turks. a House of Representatives of 50 members, also with a 7-to-3 ratio, were to be separately elected by communal balloting on a universal suffrage basis. In addition, separate Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communal chambers were provided to exercise control in matters of religion, culture, and education. According to Article 78(2), any law imposing duties or taxes shall require a simple majority of the representatives elected by the Greek and Turkish communities respectively taking part in the vote. Legislation on other subjects was to take place by simple majority, but again the President and the Vice President had the same right of veto absolute on foreign affairs, defense and internal security, delaying on other matters as in the Council of Ministers. The judicial system would be headed by a Supreme Constitutional Court, composed of one Greek Cypriot and one Turkish Cypriot and presided over by a contracted judge from a neutral country. The Constitution of Cyprus, whilst establishing an independent and sovereign republic, was, in the words of De Smith, an authority on constitutional law. Unique in its tortuous complexity and in the multiplicity of the safeguards that it provides for the principal minority. The Constitution of Cyprus stands alone among the constitutions of the world. Within a short period of time the first dispute started to arise between the two communities. Issues of contention included taxation and the creation of separate municipalities. Because of the legislative veto system, this resulted in a lockdown in communal and state politics in many cases. Repeated attempts to solve the disputes failed. Eventually, on November 30, 1963, Makarios put forward to the three guarantors a 13-point proposal designed, in his view, to eliminate impediments to the functioning of the government. The 13 points involved constitutional revisions, including the abandonment of the veto power by both the president and the vice president. Turkey initially rejected it. A few days later, on Bloody Christmas December 21, 1963, fighting erupted between the communities in Nicosia. In the days that followed it spread across the rest of the island. At the same time, the power-sharing government collapsed. How this happened is one of the most contentious issues in modern Cypriot history. The Greek Cypriots argue that the Turkish Cypriots withdrew in order to form their own administration. The Turkish Cypriots maintain that they were forced out. Many Turkish Cypriots chose to withdraw from the government. However, in many cases those who wished to stay in their jobs were prevented from doing so by the Greek Cypriots. Also, many of the Turkish Cypriots refused to attend because they feared for their lives after the recent violence that had erupted. There was even some pressure from the TMT as well. In any event, in the days that followed the fighting a frantic effort was made to calm tensions. In the end, on December 27, 1963, an interim peacekeeping force, the Joint Truce Force, was put together by Britain, Greece and Turkey. After the partnership government collapsed, the Greek Cypriot-led administration was recognized as the legitimate government of the Republic of Cyprus at the stage of the debates in New York in February 1964. The Joint Truce Force held the line until a United Nations Peacekeeping Force, UNFISP, was formed following United Nations Security Council Resolution 186, passed on March 4, 1964. Peacemaking efforts, 1964–1974 At the same time as it established a peacekeeping force, the Security Council also recommended that the Secretary-General, in consultation with the parties and the guarantor powers, designate a mediator to take charge of formal peacemaking efforts. Uthand, then the UN Secretary-General, appointed Sakari Tuomija, a Finnish diplomat. While Tuomija viewed the problem as essentially international in nature and saw enosis as the most logical course for a settlement, he rejected union on the grounds that it would be inappropriate for a UN official to propose a solution that would lead to the dissolution of a UN member state. The United States held a differing view. In early June, following another Turkish threat to intervene, Washington launched an independent initiative under Dean Acheson, a former Secretary of State. In July he presented a plan to unite Cyprus with Greece. In return for accepting this, Turkey would receive a sovereign military base on the island. The Turkish Cypriots would also be given minority rights, which would be overseen by a resident international commissioner. Makarios rejected the proposal, arguing that giving Turkey territory would be a limitation on Enosis and would give Ankara too strong a say in the island's affairs. A second version of the plan was presented that offered Turkey a 50-year lease on a base. This offer was rejected by the Greek Cypriots and by Turkey. After several further attempts to reach an agreement, the United States was eventually forced to give up its effort. Following the sudden death of Ambassador Tuamija in August, Galo Plaza was appointed mediator. He viewed the problem in communal terms. In March 1965 he presented a report criticizing both sides for their lack of commitment to reaching a settlement. While he understood the Greek Cypriot aspiration of Enosis, he believed that any attempt at union should be held in voluntary abeyance. Similarly, he considered that the Turkish Cypriots should refrain from demanding a federal solution to the problem. Although the Greek Cypriots eventually accepted the report, despite its opposition to immediate Enosis, Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots rejected the plan, calling on Plaza to resign on the grounds that he had exceeded his mandate by advancing specific proposals. He was simply meant to broker an agreement. But the Greek Cypriots made it clear that if Galo Plaza resigned they would refuse to accept a replacement. Euthant was left with no choice but to abandon the mediation effort. Instead he decided to make his good offices available to the two sides via Resolution 186 of March 4, 1964 and a mediator was appointed. In his report, the mediator, Dr. Galo Plaza, criticized the 1960 legal framework, and proposed necessary amendments which were rejected by Turkey, a fact which resulted in serious deterioration of the situation with constant threats by Turkey against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Cyprus, necessitating a series of UN resolutions calling, inter alia, for respect of the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Cyprus. The Secretary-General of the United Nations in 1965 described the policy of the Turkish Cypriot leaders in this way: the Turkish Cypriot leaders have adhered to a rigid stand against any measures which might involve having members of the two communities live and work together, or which might place Turkish Cypriots in situations where they would have to acknowledge the authority of government agents. Indeed, since the Turkish Cypriot leadership is committed to physical and geographical separation of the communities as a political goal, it is not likely to encourage activities by Turkish Cypriots which may be interpreted as demonstrating the merits of an alternative policy. The result has been a seemingly deliberate policy of self-segregation by the Turkish Cypriots. Report S/6426. The end of the mediation effort was effectively confirmed when, at the end of the year, Plaza resigned and was not replaced. In March 1966, a more modest attempt at peacemaking was initiated under the auspices of Carlos Bernades, the Secretary-General's special representative for Cyprus. Instead of trying to develop formal proposals for the parties to bargain over, he aimed to encourage the two sides agree to settlement through direct dialogue. However, ongoing political chaos in Greece prevented any substantive discussions from developing. The situation changed the following year. On April 21, 1967, a coup d'état in Greece brought to power a military administration. Just months later, in November 1967, Cyprus witnessed its most severe bout of intercommunal fighting since 1964. Responding to a major attack on Turkish Cypriot villages in the south of the island, which left 27 dead, Turkey bombed Greek Cypriot forces and appeared to be readying itself for an intervention. Greece was forced to capitulate. Following international intervention, Greece agreed to recall General George Grivas, the commander of the Greek Cypriot National Guard and former EOKA leader, and reduce its forces on the island. Capitalizing on the weakness of the Greek Cypriots, the Turkish Cypriots proclaimed their own provisional administration on December 28, 1967. Makarios immediately declared the new administration illegal. Nevertheless, a major change had occurred. The Archbishop, along with most other Greek Cypriots, began to accept that the Turkish Cypriots would have to have some degree of political autonomy. It was also realized that unification of Greece and Cyprus was unachievable under the prevailing circumstances. In May 1968, intercommunal talks began between the two sides under the auspices of the good offices of the UN Secretary-General. Unusually, The talks were not held between President Makarios and Vice President Kuk. Instead they were conducted by the presidents of the communal chambers, Glafkos Klerides and Ralph Dunkai. Again, little progress was made. During the first round of talks, which lasted until August 1968, the Turkish Cypriots were prepared to make several concessions regarding constitutional matters, but Makarios refused to grant them greater autonomy in return. The second round of talks, which focused on local government, was equally unsuccessful. In December 1969 a third round of discussion started. This time they focused on constitutional issues. Yet again there was little progress, and when they ended in September 1970 the Secretary-General blamed both sides for the lack of movement. A fourth and final round of intercommunal talks also focused on constitutional issues, but again failed to make much headway before they were forced to a halt in 1974. Turkish invasion of 1974. After 1967, tensions between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots subsided. Instead, the main source of tension on the island came from factions within the Greek Cypriot community. Although Makarios had effectively abandoned Enosis in favor of an attainable solution, many others continued to believe that the only legitimate political aspirations for Greek Cypriots was union with Greece. In September 1971 Grivas secretly returned to the island and formed EOKAB, a very pro-union organization. In early 1974, Grivas died and EOKAB fell under the direct control of Taxiarchus Demetrios Ioannidis, the new head of the junta in Athens. Ioannidis was determined to overthrow Makarios. Fearing the consequences of such a step, in early July 1974 Makarios wrote an open letter to the military dictatorship requesting that all Greek officers be removed from the island. On July 15, Ioannidis replied by enacting the 1974 Cypriot coup d'état copyright by the Cyprus National Guard, which resulted in Makarios being deposed. The president installed by the coup was Nikos Sampson. After failing to secure British support for a joint intervention under the Treaty of Guarantee, bar one quarter lent to Kevit, the Turkish Prime Minister, decided to act unilaterally. On July 20 Turkey ordered a military invasion of the island. Within 2 days, Turkish forces had established a narrow corridor linking the north coast with Nicosia. The intervention led to turmoil in Greece. On July 23, the military junta collapsed. 2 days later formal peace talks were convened in Geneva between Greece, Turkey and Britain. Over the course of the following 5 days Turkey agreed to halt its advance on the condition that it would remain on the island until a political settlement was reached between the two sides. On August 8 another round of discussion was held in Geneva, Switzerland. Unlike before, this time the talks involved the Greek and Turkish Cypriots. During the discussions the Turkish Cypriots, supported by Turkey, insisted on some form of geographical separation between the two communities. Makarios refused to accept the demand, insisting that Cyprus must remain a unitary state. Despite efforts to break the deadlock, the two sides refused to budge. On August 14, Turkey demanded from Klerides acceptance of a proposal for a federal state, in which the Turkish Cypriot community would have received 34% of the island. Klerides asked for 36 to 48 hours to consult with the Cypriot and Greek governments, but Turkey refused to grant any consultation time, effectively ending the talks. Within hours, Turkey had resumed its second offensive. By the time a new, and permanent, ceasefire was called 36% of the island was under the control of the Turkish military. The partition was marked by the United Nations buffer zone in Cyprus or Green Line running east to west across the island. The effect of the division was catastrophic for all concerned. Thousands of Greek and Turkish Cypriots had been killed, wounded or missing. A further 200,000 Greek and Turkish Cypriots had been displaced. In addition to the entire north coast and the Karpas Peninsula, the Greek Cypriots were also forced to flee the eastern port city of Famagusta. The vast majority of the Turkish-occupied area was predominantly populated and owned by Greek Cypriots prior to 1974. In the process about 160,000 euro 200,000 Greek Cypriots who made up 82% of the population in the north became refugees. Many of them fleeing at the word of the approaching Turkish army. Since 1974, the ceasefire line separates the two communities on the island, and is commonly referred to as the Green Line. The United Nations consented to the transfer of the remainder of the 51,000 Turkish Cypriots that were trapped in the south to settle in the north, if they wished to do so. Many of them had previously moved to the areas under UK sovereign control awaiting permission to be transferred to the areas under Turkish control. Peace negotiations, 1974 Euro 1994. 1974 Greek coup d'état and Turkish invasion equals. After 1967 some hopes arose that a compromise on separate municipalities could be achieved in negotiations between Glafkos and Rauf Deunkai and certainly agreement came close, but the Makarios government could not accept de jure separateness, which would have denied the principle of the unitary, if bicommunal, state. Intercommunal strife was also overshadowed during this period by a serious rift on the Greek side, between Makarios and the Enosis National Front supported by the Greek junta. Makarios had now become an obstacle to Enosis. An attempt was made on his life, and Grivas returned in 1971 to head a new organization, EOKAB, with Makarios, rather than the Turkish Cypriots, in its sight. Makarios was told from Athens to dismiss his foreign minister and to regard Athens as the national center. Makarios rallied supporters successfully against attempts to remove him. He was still popular in Cyprus. Matters became worse when a new junta came to power in September 1973, and there was less relief from rightist pressure than might have been expected when Grivas died suddenly in January 1974. The pressure mounted until a peace operation in July 1974 allegedly led by a hammer of the Turks Nikos Sampson, overthrew Makarios, who managed to flee the country via a British base. For Turkey this raised the spectre of Greek control of Cyprus. The Turkish government therefore now demanded that Greece should dismiss Sampson, withdraw all Greek officers from the island and respect the island's independence. The Greek military government refused. For the United States, Kissinger did not seem to be greatly disturbed by the Sampson coup and looked as if he could accept Enosis. Turkish Prime Minister Ecevit's assertiveness and foreign policy, reinforced by his junior coalition partner, strongly inclined the Turks to intervene. The British were invited to participate in military operations, under the Treaty of Guarantee, but declined. The American envoy Joseph Sisko tried unsuccessfully to persuade the Greek military government to accept Ecevit's conditions for a Cyprus settlement, which included Turkish Cypriot control of a coastal region in the north and negotiations for a federal solution. The Soviet Union stood aside, not wanting to see Enosis, which would strengthen NATO and weaken the left in Cyprus. Turkey intervened on July 20, 1974, having the right to do so unilaterally as concerted action had not proved possible. Under the 1960 treaty, Turkey's sole object could be to re-establish the state of affairs guaranteed by the basic articles of the 1960 constitution. The coup d'état was said by Makarios himself to be an attempt to extend Greek dictatorship to the island. Launched with relatively few troops, the Turkish landing had limited success at first, and resulted everywhere on the island in the occupation of Turkish Cypriot enclaves by the Greek forces. After securing a more or less satisfactory bridgehead, Turkish forces agreed to a ceasefire on July 23, 1974. The same day civilian government under Karamanlis took office in Athens, the day the Sampson coup collapsed. Glafkos became the acting president in absence still of Makarios. A conference of the guarantor powers, Greece, Turkey and Britain, met in Geneva on July 25. Meanwhile, Turkish troops did not refrain from extending their positions, as more Turkish Cypriot enclaves were occupied by Greek forces. A new ceasefire line was agreed. On July 30 the powers agreed that the withdrawal of Turkish troops from the island should be linked to a just and lasting settlement acceptable to all parties concerned. The declaration also spoke of two autonomous administrations, that of Greek Cypriot community and that of the Turkish Cypriot community. Division of the island equals. At the Second Geneva Conference on August 9, Turkey pressed for a federal solution to the problem against stiffening Greek resistance. Whilst Turkish Cypriots wanted a bizonal federation, Turkey, under American advice, submitted a cantonal plan involving separation of Turkish Cypriot areas from one another. For security reasons, Turkish Cypriots did not favor cantons. Each plan embraced about 34% of the territory. These plans were presented to the conference on August 13 by the Turkish Foreign Minister, Garwan Kortaniya. Clerides wanted 36 to 48 hours to consider the plans, but Garwan Kortaniya demanded an immediate response. This was regarded as unreasonable by the Greeks, the British and the Americans, who were in close consultation. Nevertheless, the next day, the Turkish forces extended their control to some 36% of the island. They were afraid that delay would turn international opinion strongly against them if Greek spoiling tactics were given a chance, and they were determined to come to the rescue of greatly threatened Turkish Cypriots whose enclaves were still occupied by Greek forces. Turkey's international reputation suffered as a result of the precipitate move of the Turkish military to extend control to a third of the island. The British Prime Minister regarded the Turkish ultimatum as unreasonable since it was presented without allowing adequate time for study. In Greek eyes, the Turkish proposals were submitted in the full awareness that the Greek side could not accept them and reflected the Turkish desire for a military base in Cyprus. The Greek side has gone some way in their proposals by recognizing Turkish groups of villages in Turkish administrative areas. But they stressed that the constitutional order of Cyprus should retain its bicommunal character based on the coexistence of the Greek and Turkish communities within the framework of a sovereign, independent and integral republic. Essentially, the Turkish side's proposals were for geographic consolidation and separation and for a much larger measure of autonomy for that area, or those areas, than the Greek side could envisage. 1975 Euro 1979 On April 28, 1975, Kurt Waldheim, the UN Secretary-General, launched a new mission of good offices. Starting in Vienna, over the course of the following 10 months, Clerides and Dinkai discussed a range of humanitarian issues relating to the events of the previous year. However, attempts to make progress on the substantive issues such as territory and the nature of the central government failed to produce any results. After 5 rounds, the talks fell apart in February 1976. In January 1977, the UN managed to organize a meeting in Nicosia between Makarios and Dinkai. This led to a major breakthrough. On February 12, the two leaders signed a 4-point agreement confirming that a future Cyprus settlement would be based on a federation. The size of the states would be determined by economic viability and land ownership. The central government would be given powers to ensure the unity of the state. Various other issues, such as freedom of movement and freedom of settlement, would be settled through discussion. Just months later, in August 1977, Makarios died. He was replaced by Spyros Kyprianou, the foreign minister. In May 1979, Waldheim visited Cyprus and secured a further 10-point set of proposals 1979 from the two sides. In addition to reaffirming the 1977 high-level agreement, these also included provisions for the demilitarization of the island and a commitment to refrain from destabilizing activities and actions. Shortly afterwards, a new round of discussions began in Nicosia. Again, they were short-lived. For a start, the Turkish Cypriots did not want to discuss Varosha, a resort quarter of Famagusta that had been vacated by Greek Cypriots when it was overrun by Turkish troops. This was a key issue for the Greek Cypriots. Secondly, the two sides failed to agree on the concept of bicommunality. The Turkish Cypriots believed that the Turkish Cypriot federal state would be exclusively Turkish Cypriot and the Greek Cypriot state would be exclusively Greek Cypriots. The Greek Cypriots believed that the two states should be predominantly, but not exclusively, made up of a particular community. Turkish Cypriots Declaration of Independence In May 1983, an effort by Javier Parr copyright Res de Coué copyright La, the then UN Secretary-General, founded after the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the withdrawal of all occupation forces from Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriots were furious at the resolution. They threatened to declare independence in retaliation. Despite this, in August, Par Copyright Res de Copyright Law gave the two sides a set of proposals for consideration that called for a rotating presidency, the establishment of a bicameral assembly along the same lines as previously suggested, and 60-40 representation in the central executive. In return for increased representation in the central government, the Turkish Cypriots would surrender 8 to €13% of the land in their possession. Both Kyprianou and Diankari accepted the proposals. However, on November 15, 1983, the Turkish Cypriots took advantage of the post-election political instability in Turkey and unilaterally declared independence. Within days the Security Council passed a resolution, number 541, making it clear that it would not accept the new state and that the decision disrupted efforts to reach a settlement. Diankari denied this. In a letter addressed to the Secretary-General informing him of the decision, he insisted that the move guaranteed that any future settlement would be truly federal in nature. Although the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was soon recognized by Turkey, the rest of the international community condemned the move. The Security Council passed another resolution, number 550, condemning the purported exchange of ambassadors between Turkey and the Turkish Cypriot leadership. In September 1984 talks resumed. After 3 rounds of discussions it was again agreed that Cyprus would become a bizonal, bicommunal, non-aligned federation. The Turkish Cypriots would retain 29% for their federal state and all foreign troops would leave the island. In January 1985, the two leaders met for their first face-to-face talks since the 1979 agreement. However, while the general belief was that the meeting was being held to agree to a final settlement, Kyprianou insisted that it was a chance for further negotiations. The talks collapsed. In the aftermath, the Greek Cypriot leaders came in for heavy criticism, both at home and abroad. After that, Diankari announced that he would not make so many concessions again. Undeterred, in March 1986, de Copyright Law presented the two sides with a draft framework agreement. Again, the plan envisaged the creation of an independent, non-aligned, bicommunal, bizonal state in Cyprus. However, the Greek Cypriots were unhappy with the proposals. They argued that the questions of removing Turkish forces from Cyprus was not addressed, nor was the repatriation of the increasing number of Turkish settlers on the island. Moreover, there were no guarantees that the full 3 freedoms would be respected. Finally, they saw the proposed state structure as being confederal in nature. Further efforts to produce an agreement failed as the two sides remained steadfastly attached to their positions. The set of ideas equals. In August 1988, Par Copyright Res de Copyright Law called upon the two sides to meet with him in Geneva in August. There the two leaders George Vasilia and Ralph Diankari agreed to abandon the draft framework agreement and return to the 1977 and 1979 high-level agreements. However, the talks faltered when the Greek Cypriots announced their intention to apply for membership within the European Community, a move strongly opposed by Turkish Cypriots and Turkey. Nevertheless, in June 1989, de presented the two communities with a set of ideas. Diankari quickly rejected them as he not only opposed the provisions, he also argued that the UN Secretary-General had no right to present formal proposals to the two sides. The two sides met again, in New York, in February 1990. However, the talks were again short-lived. This time Diankari demanded that the Greek Cypriots recognize the existence of two peoples in Cyprus and the basic right of the Turkish Cypriots to self-determination. On July 4, 1990, Cyprus formally applied to join the EC. The Turkish Cypriots and Turkey, which had applied for membership in 1987, were outraged. Diankari claimed that Cyprus could only join the community at the same time as Turkey and called off all talks with UN officials. Nevertheless, in September 1990, the EC member states unanimously agreed to refer the Cypriot application to the Commission for formal consideration. In retaliation, Turkey and the TRNC signed a joint declaration abolishing passport controls and introducing a customs union just weeks later. Undeterred, Javier Parr copyright res de Coué copyright law continued his search for a solution throughout 1991. He made no progress. In his last report to the Security Council, presented in October 1991 under United Nations Security Council Resolution 716, he blamed the failure of the talks on Diyarbakir, noting the Turkish Cypriot leaders' demand that the two communities should have equal sovereignty and a right to secession. On April 3, 1992, Boutros Ghali, the new UN Secretary-General, presented the Security Council with the outline plan for the creation of a bizonal, bi-communal federation that would prohibit any form of partition, secession or union with another state. While the Greek Cypriots accepted the set of ideas as a basis for negotiation, Diyarbakir again criticized the UN Secretary-General for exceeding his authority. When he did eventually return to the table, the Turkish Cypriot leader complained that the proposals failed to recognize his community. In November, Ghali brought the talks to a halt. He now decided to take a different approach and tried to encourage the two sides to show goodwill by accepting 8 confidence-building measures. These included reducing military forces on the island, transferring Varasha to direct UN control, reducing restrictions on contacts between the two sides, undertaking an island-wide census and conducting feasibility studies regarding a solution. The Security Council endorsed the approach. On May 24, 1993, the Secretary-General formally presented the two sides with his CBMs. Diyarbakir, while accepting some of the proposals, was not prepared to agree to the package as a whole. Meanwhile, on June 30, the European Commission returned its opinion in the Cypriot application for membership. While the decision provided a ringing endorsement of the case for Cypriot membership, it refrained from opening the way for immediate negotiations. The Commission stated that it felt that the issue should be reconsidered in January 1995, taking into account the positions adopted by each party in the talks. A few months later, in December 1993, Glafkos Clerides proposed the demilitarization of Cyprus. Diyarbakir dismissed the idea, but the next month he announced that he would be willing to accept the CBMs in principle. Proximity talks started soon afterwards. In March 1994, the UN presented the two sides with a draft document outlining the proposed measures in greater detail. Clerides said that he would be willing to accept the document if Diyarbakir did, but the Turkish Cypriot leader refused on the grounds that it would upset the balance of forces on the island. Once again, Ghali had little choice but to pin the blame for another breakdown of talks on the Turkish Cypriot side. Diyarbakir would be willing to accept mutually agreed changes, but Clerides refused to negotiate any further changes to the March proposals. Further proposals put forward by the Secretary-General in an attempt to break the deadlock were rejected by both sides. Deadlock and legal battles, 1994 97 at the Corfu European Council, held on 24 June 25, 1994, the EU officially confirmed that Cyprus would be included in the Union's next phase of enlargement. 2 weeks later, on July 5, the European Court of Justice imposed restrictions on the export of goods from northern Cyprus into the European Union. Soon afterwards, in December, relations between the EU and Turkey were further damaged when Greece blocked the final implementation of a customs union. As a result, talks remained completely blocked throughout 1995 and 1996. The situation took another turn for the worse at the start of 1997 when the Greek Cypriots announced that they intended to purchase the Russian-made S-300 anti-aircraft missile system. Soon afterwards, Cyprus missile crisis started. The crisis effectively ended in December 1998 with the decision of the Cypriot government to transfer the S-300s to Crete, in exchange for alternative weapons from Greece. In December 1996, the European Court of Human Rights delivered a landmark ruling that declared that Turkey was an occupying power in Cyprus. The case Loizaido vs. Turkey centered on Tatina Loizaido, a refugee from Kyrenia, who was judged to have been unlawfully denied the control of her property by Turkey. The case also had severe financial implications as the court later ruled that Turkey should pay Mrs. Loizado US $825,000 in compensation for the loss of use of her property. Ankara rejected the ruling as politically motivated. After 20 years of talks, a settlement seemed as far off as ever. However, the basic parameters of a settlement were by now internationally agreed. Cyprus would be a bizonal, bicommunal federation. A solution would also be expected to address the following issues: constitutional framework, territorial adjustments, return of property to pre-1974 owners and/or compensation payments, return of displaced persons, demilitarization of Cyprus, residency rights, repatriation of Turkish settlers, future peacekeeping arrangements. EU accession and the settlement process, 1997 present. In 1997 the basic parameters of the Cyprus dispute changed. A decision by the European Union to open up accession negotiations with the Republic of Cyprus created a new catalyst for a settlement. Among those who supported the move, the argument was made that Turkey could not have a veto on Cypriot accession and that the negotiations would encourage all sides to be more moderate. However, opponents of the move argued that the decision would remove the incentive of the Greek Cypriots to reach a settlement. They would instead wait until they became a member and then use this strength to push for a settlement on their terms. In response to the decision, Rauf Dinkari announced that he would no longer accept federation as a basis for a settlement. In the future he would only be prepared to negotiate on the basis of a confederal solution. In December 1999 tensions between Turkey and the European Union eased somewhat after the EU decided to declare Turkey a candidate for EU membership, a decision taken at the Helsinki European Council. At the same time a new round of talks started in New York. These were short-lived. By the following summer they had broken down. Tensions started to rise again as a showdown between Turkey and the European Union loomed over the island's accession. Perhaps realizing the gravity of the situation, and in a move that took observers by surprise, Rauf Dinkari wrote to Glafkos Clerides on November 8, 2001 to propose a face-to-face meeting. The offer was accepted. Following several informal meetings between the two men in November and December 2001, a new peace process started under UN auspices on January 14, 2002. At the outset the stated aim of the two leaders was to try to reach an agreement by the start of June that year. However, the talks soon became deadlocked. In an attempt to break the impasse, Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary-General, visited the island in May that year. Despite this, no deal was reached. After a summer break, Annan met with the two leaders again that autumn, first in Paris and then in New York. As a result of the continued failure to reach an agreement, the Security Council agreed that the Secretary-General should present the two sides with a blueprint settlement. This would form the basis of further negotiations. The original version of the UN peace plan was presented to the two sides by Annan on November 11, 2002. A little under a month later, and following modifications submitted by the two sides, it was revised. It was hoped that this plan would be agreed by the two sides on the margins of the European Council, which was held in Copenhagen on December 13. However, Rauf Dinkari, who was recuperating from major heart surgery, declined to attend. The EU therefore decided to confirm that Cyprus would join the EU on May 1, 2004, along with Malta and 8 other states from Central and Eastern Europe. Although it had been expected that talks would be unable to continue, discussions resumed in early January 2003. Thereafter, a further revision took place in February 2003, when Annan made a second visit to the island. During his stay he also called on the two sides to meet with him again the following month in The Hague, where he would expect their answer on whether they were prepared to put the plan to a referendum. While the Greek Cypriot side, which was now led by Tassos Papadopoulos, agreed to do so, albeit reluctantly, Rauf Dinkari refused to allow a popular vote. The peace talks collapsed. A month later, on April 16, 2003, Cyprus formally signed the EU Treaty of Accession at a ceremony in Athens. Throughout the rest of the year there was no effort to restart talks. Instead, attention turned to the Turkish Cypriot elections, which were widely expected to see a victory by moderate pro-solution parties. In the end, the assembly was evenly split. A coalition administration was formed that brought together the pro-solution CTP and the Democrat Party, which had traditionally taken the line adopted by Rauf Dinkaya. This opened the way for Turkey to press for new discussions. After a meeting between Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Kofi Annan in Switzerland, the leaders of the two sides were called to New York. There they agreed to start a new negotiation process based on two phases: Phase 1, which would just involve the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, being held on the island, and Phase 2, which would also include Greece and Turkey, being held elsewhere. After a month of negotiations in Cyprus, the discussions duly moved to Bürgenstock, Switzerland. The Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Dinkaya rejected the plan outright and refused to attend these talks. Instead, his son Serdar Dinkaya and Mehmet Ali Talat attended in his place. A fourth version of the plan was presented. This was short-lived. After final adjustments, a fifth and final version of the plan was presented to the two sides on March 31, 2004. The Union Plan for Settlement . Under the final proposals, the Republic of Cyprus would become the United Cyprus Republic. It would be a loose federation composed of two component states. The northern Turkish Cypriot constituent state would encompass about 28.5% of the island, the southern Greek Cypriot constituent state would be made up of the remaining 71.5%. Each part would have had its own parliament. There would also be a bicameral parliament on the federal level. In the Chamber of Deputies, the Turkish Cypriots would have 25% of the seats. The Senate would consist of equal parts of members of each ethnic group. Executive power would be vested in a presidential council. The chairmanship of this council would rotate between the communities. Each community would also have the right to veto all legislation. One of the most controversial elements of the plan concerned property. During Turkey's military invasion in 1974, many Greek Cypriots were forced to abandon their homes. Since then, the question of restitution of their property has been a central demand of the Greek Cypriot side. However, the Turkish Cypriots argue that the complete return of all Greek Cypriot properties to their original owners would be incompatible with the functioning of a bizonal, bicommunal federal settlement. To this extent, they have argued compensation should be offered. The Annan plan attempted to bridge this divide. In certain areas, such as Morphon and Famagusta, which would be returned to Greek Cypriot control, Greek Cypriot refugees would have received back all of their property according to a phased timetable. In other areas, such as Kyrenia and the Karpas Peninsula, which would remain under Turkish Cypriot control, they would be given back a proportion of their land and would receive compensation for the rest. All land and property belonging to businesses and institutions, including the church, the largest property owner on the island, would have been expropriated. While many Greek Cypriots found these provisions unacceptable in themselves, many others resented the fact that the plan envisaged all compensation claims by a particular community to be met by their own side. This was seen as unfair, as Turkey would not be required to contribute any funds towards the compensation. Apart from the property issue, there were many other parts of the plan that sparked controversy. For example, the agreement envisaged the gradual reduction in the number of Greek and Turkish troops on the island. After 6 years, the number of soldiers from each country would be limited to 6,000. This would fall to 600 after 19 years. Thereafter, the aim would be to try to achieve full demilitarization, a process that many hoped would be made possible by Turkish accession to the European Union. The agreement also kept in place the Treaty of Guarantee, an integral part of the 1960 constitution that gave Britain, Greece and Turkey a right to intervene militarily in the island's affairs. Many Greek Cypriots were concerned that the continuation of the right of intervention would give Turkey too large a say in the future of the island. However, most Turkish Cypriots felt that a continued Turkish military presence was necessary to ensure their security. Another element of the plan the Greek Cypriots objected to was that it allowed many Turkish citizens who had been brought to the island to remain. Referendums, April 24, 2004. Under the terms of the plan, the Annan Plan would only come into force if accepted by the two communities in simultaneous referendums. These were set for April 24, 2004. In the weeks that followed there was intense campaigning in both communities. However, and in spite of opposition from Rauf Deunkai, who had boycotted the talks in Switzerland, it soon became clear that the Turkish Cypriots would vote in favor of the agreement. Among Greek Cypriots, opinion was heavily weighted against the plan. Tassos Papadopoulos, the president of Cyprus, in a speech delivered on April 7 called on Greek Cypriots to reject the plan. His position was supported by the centrist Diko party and the socialists of EDEK as well as other smaller parties. His major coalition partner AKEL, one of the largest parties on the island, chose to reject the plan, bowing to the wishes of the majority of the party base. Support for the plan was voiced by Democratic Rally leadership, the main right-wing party, despite opposition to the plan from the majority of party followers, and the United Democrats, a small center-left party led by George Vasilia, a former president. Glafkos Klerides, now retired from politics, also supported the plan. Prominent members of DISY who did not support the Annan Plan split from the party and openly campaigned against it. The Greek Cypriot Church also opposed the plan in line with the views of the majority of public opinion. The United Kingdom and the United States came out in favor of the plan. Turkey signaled its support for the plan. The Greek government decided to remain neutral. However, Russia was troubled by an attempt by Britain and the US to introduce a resolution in the UN Security Council supporting the plan and used its veto to block the move. This was done because they believed that the resolution would provide external influence to the internal debate, which they did not view as fair. In April 24 referendum, the Turkish Cypriots endorsed the plan by a margin of almost 2-1. However, the Greek Cypriots resoundingly voted against the plan, by a margin of about 3-1. Referendum results. The Cyprus dispute after the referendum. In 2004, the Turkish Cypriot community was awarded observer status in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, as part of the Cypriot delegation. Since then, 2 Turkish Cypriot representatives of PACE are elected in the Assembly of Northern Cyprus. On May 1, 2004, a week after the referendum, Cyprus joined the European Union. Under the terms of accession, the whole island is considered to be a member of the European Union. However, the terms of the acquis communautaire, the EU's body of laws, have been suspended in northern Cyprus. After the referendum, in June 2004, the Turkish Cypriot community, and despite the objection of the Cypriot government, had its designation at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, of which it has been an observer since 1979, changed to the Turkish Cypriot state. Despite initial hopes that a new process to modify the rejected plan would start by autumn, most of the rest of 2004 was taken up with discussions over a proposal by the European Union to open up direct trade with the Turkish Cypriots and provided $259 million in funds to help them upgrade their infrastructure. This has provoked considerable debate. The Republic of Cyprus has argued that there can be no direct trade via ports and airports in northern Cyprus as these are unrecognized. Instead, it is offered to allow Turkish Cypriots to use Greek Cypriot facilities, which are internationally recognized. This has been rejected by the Turkish Cypriots. At the same time, attention turned to the question of the start of Turkey's future membership of the European Union. At a European Council held on December 17, 2004, and despite earlier Greek Cypriot threats to impose a veto, Turkey was granted a start date for formal membership talks on condition that it signed a protocol extending the customs union to the new entrants to the EU, including Cyprus. Assuming this is done, formal membership talks would begin on October 3, 2005. Following the defeat of the UN plan in the referendum, there has been no attempt to restart negotiations between the two sides. While both sides have reaffirmed their commitment to continuing efforts to reach an agreement, the UN Secretary-General has not been willing to restart the process until he can be sure that any new negotiations will lead to a comprehensive settlement based on the plan he put forward in 2004. To this end, he has asked the Greek Cypriots to present a written list of the changes they would like to see made to the agreement. This was rejected by President Tassos Papadopoulos on the grounds that no side should be expected to present their demands in advance of negotiations. However, it appears as though the Greek Cypriots would be prepared to present their concerns orally. Another Greek Cypriot concern centers on the procedural process for new talks. Mr. Papadopoulos said that he will not accept arbitration or timetables for discussions. The union fears that this would lead to another open-ended process that could drag on indefinitely. In October 2012, Northern Cyprus became an observer member country of the Economic Cooperation Organization under the name Turkish Cypriot State. Formula 1 and the Cyprus dispute the podium display after the 2006 Turkish Grand Prix caused a controversy, when winner Felipe Massa received the trophy from Mehmet Ali Talat, who was referred to as the President of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The government of the Republic of Cyprus filed an official complaint with the FIA. After investigating the incident, the FIA fined the organizers of the Grand Prix $5 million on September 19, 2006. The Turkish Motorsports Federation and the organizers of the Turkish Grand Prix agreed to pay half the fined sum pending an appeal to be heard by the FIA International Court of Appeal on November 7, 2006. Tosfot insisted the move was not planned and that Mehmet Ali Talat did fit FIA's criteria for podium presentations as a figure of world standing. Keen to repair their impartiality in international politics, FIA stood their ground forcing the appeal to be withdrawn. 2008 elections in the Republic of Cyprus. In the 2008 presidential elections, Papadopoulos was defeated by AKEL candidate Dimitris Christofias, who pledged to restart talks on reunification immediately. Speaking on the election result, Mehmet Ali Talat stated that this forthcoming period will be a period during which the Cyprus problem can be solved within a reasonable space of time despite all difficulties provided that there is will. Christofias held his first meeting as president with a Turkish Cypriot leader on March 21, 2008 in the UN buffer zone in Nicosia. At the meeting, the two leaders agreed to launch a new round of substantive talks on reunification, and to reopen Ledra Street, which has been cut in two since the intercommunal violence of the 1960s and has come to symbolize the island's division. On April 3, 2008, after barriers had been removed, the Ledra Street crossing was reopened in the presence of Greek and Turkish Cypriot officials. New negotiations. A first meeting of the technical committees was set to take place on April 18, 2008. Talat and Christofias met socially at a cocktail party on May 7, 2008, and agreed to meet regularly to review the progress of the talks so far. A second formal summit was held on May 23, 2008 to review the progress made in the technical committees. At a meeting on July 1, 2008, the two leaders agreed in principle on the concepts of a single citizenship and a single sovereignty, and decided to start direct reunification talks very soon. On the same date, former Australian Foreign Minister Alexander Downer was appointed as the new UN envoy for Cyprus. Christofias and Talat agreed to meet again on July 25, 2008 for a final review of the preparatory work before the actual negotiations would start. Christofias was expected to propose a rotating presidency for the United Cypriot State. Talat stated he expected they would set a date to start the talks in September, and reiterated that he would not agree to abolishing the guarantor rules of Turkey and Greece. After the conclusion of negotiations, a reunification plan would be put to referendums in both communities. In December 2008, the Athenian socialist daily newspaper Tavima described a crisis in relations between Christofias and Talat, with the Turkish Cypriots beginning to speak openly of a loose confederation, an idea strongly opposed by South Nicosia. Tensions were further exacerbated by Turkey's harassment of Cypriot vessels engaged in oil exploration in the island's exclusive economic zone, and by the Turkish Cypriot leadership's alignment with Ankara's claim that Cyprus has no continental shelf. On April 29, 2009, Talat stated that if the Court of Appeal of England and Wales makes a decision just like in the same spirit with the decision of European Court of Justice, then the negotiation process in Cyprus will be damaged in such a way that it will never be repaired once more. The European Commission warned the Republic of Cyprus not to turn a Rams case legal fight to keep their holiday home into a political battle over the divided island. On January 31, 2010, United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon arrived in Cyprus to accelerate talks aimed at reuniting the country. The election of nationalist Derviye Aroayo of the National Unity Party as president in northern Cyprus on April 18 is expected to complicate reunification negotiations. Talks were resumed after the elections in late May, however, and Iraq Section Lu stated on May 27, 2010 he was now also in favor of a federal state, a change from his previous positions. In early June 2010, talks reached an impasse and UN Special Advisor Alexander Downer called on the two leaders to decide whether they wanted a solution or not. On November 18, 2010, first tripartite meeting occurred in New York City without any agreement over the main issues. On January 26, 2011, second tripartite meeting occurred in Geneva, Switzerland without any agreement over the main issues. On March 2011, United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reported, "The negotiations cannot be an open-ended process, nor can we afford interminable talks for the sake of talks." On March 18, 2011, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots realized 100th negotiation since April 2008 without any agreement over the main issues. By mid-2011, there was a renewed push for an end to negotiations by the end of 2011 in order to have a united Cyprus take over the EU presidency on July 1, 2012. On July 7, 2011, the third tripartite meeting occurred in Geneva, Switzerland without any agreement over the main issues. On October 31, 2011, the fourth tripartite meeting occurred in New York City without any agreement over the main issues. Ban said that the talks are coming to an end. On January 24, 2012, the fifth tripartite meeting occurred in New York City without any agreement over the main issues. Ban said, "I will be providing a report to the Security Council on the status of the negotiations at the end of February. At the end of March, I will seek a review of the process from my special advisor, Alexander Downer. If his report is positive, consistent with relevant Security Council resolutions and following consultations with the two sides, I intend to call a multilateral conference in late April or early May." On April 21, 2012, United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said there is not enough progress on core issues of reunification talks for calling an international conference. International observers qualified the situation as the collapse of reunification talks. Last chance for Cyprus reunification lost, UN-led rounds of talks have failed, and the failure of UN Cyprus campaign for reunification. On April 27, 2012, Special Advisor of the Secretary-General Alexander Downer said if the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot leaders cannot agree with each other on a model for a united Cyprus, then United Nations cannot make them. At the end of September 2012, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus President Dervis Iroglu said that joint committees with the Greek Cypriot side had been set up to take confidence-building measures. In 2012, the European Union, EU, funded Project Reconciliation and Peace Economics in Cyprus found that there was little hope for a settlement in the island and the UN-sponsored talks again failed. At the beginning of 2013, Cyprus negotiations were suspended because of a change of government in the Greek Cypriot community of Cyprus. On May 29, 2013, President of Rep of Cyprus, Anastasiades, said any new round of talks will not begin from the point they ended in 2012. On February 11, 2014, Alexander Downer, UN Secretary-General's Special Advisor, stepped down. The Greek and Turkish Cypriot leaders declared a joint communiqué. 2014 renewed talks. In February 2014, renewed negotiations to settle the Cyprus dispute began after several years of warm relations between the North and the South. On February 11, 2014, the leaders of Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities, Nikos Anastasiadis and Dervia Roiou, respectively, revealed the following joint declaration. The governments of both Greece and Turkey expressed their support for renewed peace talks. The declaration was also welcomed by the European Union. On February 13, 2014, Archbishop Chrysostomos lent Anastasiadis his backing on the joint declaration. On February 14, 2014, the Greek Cypriot negotiator Andreas Mavroyiannis and Turkish Cypriot negotiator Kudretas Zasay held their first meeting and agreed to visit Greece and Turkey respectively. Reactions among the Greek Cypriot political parties were mixed. The opposition AKEL party declared its support for the declaration. However, Nicholas Papadopoulos, the leader of DIKO, the main partner to Anastasiadis' party DISY in the governing coalition, opposed the declaration, and DIKO's executive committee voted on February 21 to recommend to the party's central committee that the party withdraw from the coalition from March 4. On February 27, DIKO decided to leave the coalition government, with the explanation that the joint declaration had conceded separate sovereignty to Turkish Cypriots. On May 15, 2015, in the first also known as +or-NCA +or-Anastasiadis negotiation meeting, Northern Cyprus lifted visa requirement for Greek Cypriots, and Anastasiadis presented maps of 28 minefields in the north, near the mountainous region of Pentadactylos. Opinion on solutions: a number of observers increasingly suggest partition is the best solution. An international panel of legal experts proposed the creation of a constitutional convention under European Union auspices and on the basis of the 1960 Cyprus constitution to bring together the parties directly concerned in order to reach a settlement in conformity with the fundamental principles. Euro-critical peace scholars suggest that a solution to the Cyprus conflict can only be found by including society on a broad base, as political elites started to abuse the conflict as a source of power and resources. See also: civilian casualties and displacements during the Cyprus conflict, Cypriot refugees, Operation Atla, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Representation in Cyprus, Atlas 74, Turkish invasion of Cyprus, military operations during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, confidence-building measures for the Cyprus dispute, Cyprus Euro-Turkey maritime zones dispute. Notes. Sources. Official publications and sources The House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee Report on Cyprus. Letter by the President of the Republic, Mr. Tassos Papadopoulos, to the UN Secretary-General, Mr. Kofi Annan, dated June 7, which circulated as an official document of the UN Security Council. Legal issues arising from certain population transfers and displacements on the territory of the Republic of Cyprus in the period since July 20, 1974, addressed to Cypriots by President Papadopoulos, the Republic of Cyprus Press and Information Office, Aspects of the Cyprus Problem, European Court of Human Rights Case of Cyprus v. Turkey. Other sources Getting to Yes. Suggestions for the embellishment of the Annan Plan for Cyprus Policy Paper, Southeast European Studies at Oxford, St. Antony's College, Oxford University, February 2004. Economic Aspects of the Annan Plan for the Solution of the Cyprus Problem, Wolfson College, Oxford University, February 2004. Options for Peace, Mapping the Possibilities for a Comprehensive Settlement in Cyprus, Alexandros Lordos, May 2005. From Youth to Kofi Annan, UN Peacemaking in Cyprus, 1964 2004 James Kerr Lindsay, Occasional Paper 5/05, Southeast. European Studies at Oxford, St. Antony's College, Oxford University, October 2005, EU and the Cyprus Conflict, Review of the Literature Olga Demetria, Working Paper Series in EU Border Conflicts, No. 5, January 2004. The Property Regime in a Cyprus Settlement, a reassessment of the solution proposed under the Annan Plan, given the performance of the property markets in Cyprus, 2003 2006 Stelios Plattis, Stelios Orphanides and Fiona Mullen, PRIO Report 2/2006, PRIO Cyprus Center, November 2006. Further reading. External links Timeline: a Euro-Cyprus Union resolutions list on the Cyprus issue, recent UN document, The Question of Human Rights in Cyprus, Aspects of the Cyprus Problem from the Republic of Cyprus Press and Information Office, a detailed Cyprus problem site from the TFSC in Turkey, Kissinger. A Euro unregistered trademark secret phone calls concerning Cyprus. English translation of Elftherotypia article, EU Task Force on the Turkish Cypriot Community, Cyprus and Turkey. A Euro unregistered trademark EU process. A summary of the problem from Turkish perspective, lobby for Cyprus, the displaced Greek communities of Cyprus, Greek Cypriots begin removing Nicosia barrier, Greek Cypriots tear down Nicosia's dividing wall. Documentaries, Echoes Across the Divide is an Australian documentary film about an attempt to bridge the Green Line with a bicommunal music project performed from the rooftops of Old Nicosia.